Friday the 13th is a 1980 horror slasher film directed by Sean S. Cunningham and written by Victor Miller. And it tells the story of an abandoned summer camp being reopened as a murderous force takes over. So, happy Friday the 13th, everyone. I am back to do a review of a classic horror film, the start of the Friday the 13th franchise, and subsequently, in future installments of the Friday the 13th date, I will be reviewing the subsequent films in the series. There's a lot of them, and I've already done a ranking of the movies if you want to check that out, but today I am going to be starting off with the original, the one that started it all, Friday the 13th. So, there's a lot of history to talk about here, and also a lot to say about the movie itself. This is a very interesting film. So, in 1978, Halloween came out and was a big deal in terms of horror films. John Carpenter's iconic slasher movie really paved the way for the 80s horror movies, and you could say that Friday the 13th takes a lot from Halloween. It was a very great concept, and they just executed it in a different way. Instead of being in a neighborhood, Friday the 13th takes place at a camp. Specifically, Camp Crystal Lake, which is now a pretty iconic phrase. And of course, Jason Voorhees and the hockey mask are so iconic just in the world of pop culture. But really, Jason didn't appear until Friday the 13th 2, and technically, the hockey mask didn't start until the third film. And I will have to go into spoilers here because the killer is kind of left a mystery until the end of the movie, but I'm assuming most people know the twist that Jason Voorhees is a young boy who drowned at Camp Crystal Lake back in the 1950s, and the following year, 2 camp counselors were murdered. So the camp was labeled Camp Blood, and it closed. Years later, these teens tried to reopen the camp, bring new life into it, and they were murdered one by one, as we see in the film. And it leads up to this big showdown between the main camp counselor girl and a woman by the name of Pamela Voorhees, Mrs. Voorhees, Jason's mother, who ends up being this crazy killer. She basically has a twisted sense of view where she thinks that these camp counselors were responsible for the death of her son, who is actually not really dead. That's another spoiler that I'll get to. But she goes crazy and starts murdering all these people, played wonderfully by Betsy Palmer, who originally didn't want to do this movie, but I believe she was in a car wreck right before they started shooting, and she needed money fast, so she signed on to be in Friday the 13th, and thus we have one of the greatest performances of this entire franchise. Betsy Palmer does a great job because when you first meet her character, she seems so sweet and caring and nice, and when she just snaps because of Jason, you just see everything unfold, and it's really crazy.
How are you? Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies. Look what you did to him!
There are some amazing things to talk about in this movie. The soundtrack really brings this entire movie and really the franchise together. The iconic strings. Harry Manfredini is responsible for the soundtrack, and you can just hear it all the way throughout. The tense string noises are really good. Also, Tom Savini does the makeup and gory effects. He does a pretty good job here. This is one of his earlier films that he started on, and you can definitely see his talent even in a lower budget film like this. Friday the 13th was made for a pretty modest budget and grossed in millions of dollars, so obviously they made a part 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6, and 7, and Goes to Manhattan, and Goes to Hell, and Goes to Space, and then they did a reboot. So Jason has been around for most of our lifetimes, my lifetime, and it goes to show that an interesting concept about revenge at a summer camp, such a simple, easy thing, can wind up being intriguing enough to pull a series forward with momentum. Is the first film fantastic? It's a generic 80s slasher movie, and that's interesting because the original Halloween is really the pinnacle of the Halloween franchise. The original Nightmare Before Christmas. The original Nightmare on Elm Street is probably the best of that entire series, and some argue that the original Child's Play is the best of that series. So usually the first installment is the best, and the sequels get worse. However, in the case of Friday the 13th, the first film isn't usually considered that highly. It's the sequels that add Jason, add more lore to the story, and really bulk up the series. A lot of people consider 4, 6, maybe 8 as the best movie. I like 8 personally, but everybody has a different favorite, and it really starts in the first film. Without this movie, the rest wouldn't have happened, so it's pretty crazy. The kills are pretty interesting and crazy, like I said. The music is pretty good. A lot of it plays like a 80s slasher, and you can clearly see the stains of Halloween in this movie, especially at the end, where Alice finds bodies, when they hang upside down, just like in Halloween. Their throat is slashed, and they're laying in a bed or something. It's the common tropes we've seen before. So I can't say that this is a completely original movie, but the story and the tone of the movie is quite nice. It feels like a really backwoods movie. It has a nice, quaint feeling to it, just like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre does. And I have to say, the kids act pretty naturally. Nowadays, in films, teenagers are seen as really rambunctious, like overly sexualized. But in this movie, while they do, of course, do normal teenagery stuff in horror films, they feel like real people, and it is a shame when you start seeing them die. Then when we're revealed the killer, everything clicks together, and of course you have that momentous ending, and then with Jason coming out of the water and grabbing Alice. Classic ending to a pretty interesting horror film. So with that said, I'm going to give the original Friday the 13th a 3 out of 5 skulls on the R.I.P. Reviews rating scale. If you haven't, go back and watch the original, and then start watching the sequels. You can get them for pretty cheap nowadays, and I recommend you watch them if you're a fan of horror, because this is one of the most iconic and long-lasting franchises in horror history. Happy Friday the 13th, you guys. Stay spooky, and remember, for all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer.
You're always dreaming of. Try with